Now, with consistency being one of the key factors in this year's championship, or shall I say the lack of consistency, it's going to be really interesting to see whether the Boks can back up from that mighty game against the All Blacks in the weekend. Of course, sports psychology is a huge thing, and Rusty's got a big job to do to get these boys up and ready for this challenge. I'm not going to say that the Springboks are going to take the Argentines lightly, but I think that great rivalry that the Springboks and the All Blacks have really gets the two teams into a very special mindset before they play, and trying to replicate that against other teams could be very difficult on the day. So I think the Springboks need to be very careful in terms of their preparation the week before and making sure they lead into this game to peak on that Saturday afternoon when they take on Los Pumas at Kings Park. G'day everyone, welcome to Inside Rugby with Mark, your friendly Kiwi rugby fan living here in beautiful Cancun, Mexico. Hope you all had a great weekend with the fantastic rugby that took place across the world, and it all continues, and I'm starting my series as a build up towards the next round. And there's a lot to learn from the Argentines and the way that they performed in Australia. So I want to share a few things that I learned from their performances down under and see whether or not you agree or whether you have a different version of events. Now, of course, the Pumas went to Australia looking for a couple of wins against the Wallabies, just to show to their crowd and fans across the world that they want to get rid of this label of being an inconsistent rugby team. Well, it didn't start off too well in Townsville. They got beaten in the 85th minute of the game, and quite rightly so. A lot of people were questioning some of the decisions in the game that went against the Pumas, and they were a little bit unfortunate in the outcome of that game, in my opinion. But they showed us what they've got, and they're an exciting rugby team when they play that spontaneous game of rugby against any competition, and we've seen how effective it can be against the best teams in the world. So I'm just going to give you my views on the Pumas and how I've seen them travelling so far this year in terms of their performances. Well, in that first game in Argentina against the All Blacks, I thought they were a little bit underdone. And I talked about that in my preview videos and also post-game videos. They had a different team playing against the England B team, and a lot of their players that play in Europe weren't even included in that squad. So I thought that first game that they played against the All Blacks, they were going to need to have that run, and I thought they'd be a lot better for it. I anticipated the All Blacks would win that game. They did so. And then we went to Buenos Aires, and I thought this was where it was going to be really different from the Pumas, because they'd had that hit out against the All Blacks in the first test, and surely they were going to be able to take their opportunity in the second test, and that's exactly what they did. Not only did they win for the first time against New Zealand and Argentina, but they put on a performance that they were very, very proud of and scored some wonderful points against an All Black team that had looked good the week before. But as we're seeing in this Rugby Championship, inconsistency across all teams is something that they're having to deal with week in and week out. And then the Pumas headed to Australia, and I for one gave them a very good chance of winning both games in Australia. I thought that they were going to be more spontaneous than the Wallabies and able to create more opportunities, and we saw that in that first game in Townsville, where I thought that ground was going to be a little bit more user-friendly to the Pumas, because the Australian contingency of rugby fans is really in the southern part of the country, and up there in far north Queensland you've got a lot of rugby league supporters, and we saw a lot of Los Pumas fans in the crowd there. It was an exciting day, and it was unfortunate for the Pumas, I think, that they lost that one in the 85th minute of the game with that little bit of controversy that was surrounding it. And I was a little bit disappointed for them in that particular game. I thought they played exceptionally well. But you've got to give it to Australia. They went for it at the end. They did have 3 penalty advantages going their way, and they finally got over the try line thanks to Angus Bell. So it was all to play for in Sydney last weekend, wasn't it, when the Pumas went down there? And I thought that Australia was probably going to be a bit stronger in Sydney. That's where the rugby community is in Australia, and I just thought that was going to play into their favour. Allianz Stadium had 40,000+ people in there, which was a record for a rugby game, and it was an absolutely great sight to see. So the Los Pumas really generated some interest in the game of rugby union yet again in Australia, along with the Wallabies playing very, very well this season under Joe Schmidt. Well, the game was really interesting, and now that I look back on it and watched it for the second time, there's a lot of things that I picked up on that I want to talk about as we get prepared for the Pumas going to South Africa. Now, the first thing is the Pumas had a very good lead at half-time in this game. In fact, they were ahead by 19 points to 7. And one might have thought that, well, this is really good. They've got an opportunity to control this game. But we've seen all season how good the Wallabies are at coming back in these test matches, and they never seem to be down and out. Now, we talk about the Pumas' exciting backline, but what was interesting for me in that first half in Sydney of that game in the weekend was the Pumas only scored 1 try. And it went to their captain, Julian Montoya, who went over after a great initiative to charge down the kick of Tane Edmed, and he ended up out sprinting Nick White to get to the line to score that great try. But that was the only try that the Pumas went over for in the first half, and it was telling me something that the Australians weren't giving them the opportunities to get through the defensive line, and the Pumas didn't have the answers to get in there. And the other thing we saw in this game, there was a lot of penalties given away by Australia. They weren't holding on to the ball either. Now that game ended 28-26 in favour of the Pumas in Sydney. It was very close in the last minute. They had another opportunity, Australia, although it was a very clear forward pass. I don't know what the Kiwi TMO was doing. He was probably having a cup of tea or something and missed it. And that would have been a disgrace if the Wallabies had ended up winning that game. But the Pumas held out in the end, but the statistics from the game were really interesting. They had all the possession, they had all the territory. The Aussies had 13 penalties, and they gave away 18 turnovers. But the Argentines didn't score any more tries in that game. It was all kicks from Santiago Carreras. He was absolutely on song with his kicking boot on the day, and he scored 7 penalties and 1 conversion for the Pumas. So the Wallabies did a really good job in not allowing the Pumas to use that exciting backline and get over the gain line to score tries. And I think that's something we really need to take away from this game. Now, if we have a look at the Rugby Championship standings after 4 rounds, you'll see some interesting points here. The first one is the South Africans have the best defensive record so far in this year's championship, with less than 100 points being scored against them versus all the other teams that have had over 100 points. And also from an attacking point of view, they're doing slightly better than the Argentines. So despite everybody thinking and saying that the Argentine backline is fantastic, which it is, and they score some brilliant tries, when it comes to actual results, well, against Australia last weekend, they only scored 1 try in 80 minutes of rugby, despite having all that possession and territory. So I think this is going to be an important factor as we head to Durban for the game on the 27th of September. I think the Springboks are going to play very different than how they did against New Zealand this weekend. I think the Springboks are going to go back to choking the Argentines and not to get into that battle like the Springboks did against Australia at Ellis Park earlier in the competition. I think Rassie would have learnt a lot from that game. When you try and take another team on at their own game when they're playing very well, then you get into a bit of an arm wrestle and it can go either way. So I think the Springboks are going to go back to controlling the game a little bit more and not allowing the Argentines to get that spontaneous counter-attacking ball, because they can be extremely dangerous from that. Now, out of all the interesting statistics so far in this year's Rugby Championship, no one team has won 2 games in a row. So on September the 27th in Durban, we're going to see that change, unless there's a draw in that game, of course. One of these 2 teams is likely to come out on the top, being the first team to win 2 games in a row. So that's going to be very, very interesting. And it could propel them on to winning or having a very good chance to win this year's Rugby Championship. Of course, we're 2 weeks out from the game, so we have no idea what teams are going to be selected, but the Argentine Los Pumas are going to be sweating on the availability, I think, of Thomas Albanos, their superstar number 10. Of course, he damaged his hand against the All Blacks in that game in Argentina. They'll be wanting him to come back into the team because he really is the maestro and orchestrator of their backline. Nothing against Santiago Carreras. I think he's been playing extremely well, particularly with his kicking in games against New Zealand and Australia. He did very, very well from the boot with the boot. But I just think Albanos brings something special when it comes to getting this Argentine backline away and penetrating more. And I think if he was there against Australia this weekend, we would have seen more tries from the Pumas, I believe. Now, the Pumas got a yellow card in the weekend, and they'll have to be watching their discipline because they can't afford to go down to 14 or even 13 men against the Springboks in South Africa. That will just be a case to be written off for them. So they have to make sure that their discipline's really good And one of the areas that I've been really impressed with them this year so far has been their loose forward trio. They played extremely well, and I'm talking of course about Pablo Matero, Marcos Crema, Juan Martin Gonzalez, and also Joaquim Oviedo at number 8. These guys have been putting in the big yards, and this is a big part of the Argentinian success in being able to get in there and get to the breakdown. Their halfback Gonzalo Garcia has had the most amount of passes from halfback of all the halfbacks in this year's Rugby Championship so far, with over 200 passes from the base of ruck, scrums, lineouts and mauls. So this is a fantastic statistic showing that the Argentine Los Pumas are really a team that want to distribute the ball to their backline and give them every chance of attacking. Their counter-attacking is absolutely superb, and as we saw against the Wallabies, the Springboks are going to have to be careful to make sure that their defensive line is very strong. We saw the Wallabies scoring some fantastic tries at Ellis Park, and we know that this Los Pumas team has equally amount of talent. Now it seems to me that Felipe Contaponi has got this Argentine team working very, very well. This year alone they continue to break their own history and record books by beating the All Blacks at home for the first time. They'll be absolutely motivated to go to South Africa to have a win in South Africa in Durban in 2 weeks' time, and to prove to the rugby world once again that their inconsistent label is unfounded and that they can beat top teams back to back. And I think the Rugby World Rankings at the moment are a little bit skewed because the gaps between these top teams are very, very small. And if we're talking about teams that are 6, 7 and 8 in the world rankings, they can beat these top teams on any day. I keep saying in nearly all of my videos. So I don't think the Pumas are going to go to South Africa as underdogs at all. I think they're going to go to South Africa as a team that's on a roll at the moment, that believe in themselves as much as any other team in this Rugby Championship. And they're going to be going all guns a-blazing to try and make another little piece of history in their rugby journey. I think the Pumas forwards have improved a lot this year. We talked about them probably being their weakest link in the past couple of years of rugby, but they're really coming on. I think their front row is getting better, and their locks are proving to be winners in the lineouts, and that's all you can ask from a set of forwards. But it's their backs that are really igniting the world of rugby at the moment, the likes of Choco Barras and Sinti in their midfield, and then you've got fantastic wingers in Esgro, Delgi and also Mateo Carreras. It's a fantastic opportunity for the Pumas to play some open, expansive, entertaining but also results-driven rugby. Mali at fullback has been super solid also for the Pumas this year. His counter-offensive work, his work under the high ball is really good, and I think this is something the Springboks also need to be very careful of. If they start peppering this Argentine team with high balls, they could find themselves facing some of the tries that they saw from Australia against them at Ellis Park. This Argentine team knows how to turn counter-attacking opportunities into points on the scoreboard, and that's something that South Africa needs to be very, very careful of. Now, with consistency being one of the key factors in this year's championship, or shall I say the lack of consistency, it's going to be really interesting to see whether the Boks can back up from that mighty game against the All Blacks in the weekend. Of course, sports psychology is a huge thing, and Rusty's got a big job to do to get these boys up and ready for this challenge. I'm not going to say that the Springboks are going to take the Argentines lightly, but I think that great rivalry that the Springboks and the All Blacks have really gets the two teams into a very special mindset before they play, and trying to replicate that against other teams could be very difficult on the day. So I think the Springboks need to be very careful in terms of their preparation the week before and making sure they lead into this game to peak on that Saturday afternoon when they take on Los Pumas at Kings Park. I'm truly fascinated by this encounter. I think it's going to be really exciting once again for World Rugby. We've got to expect the unexpected, whatever that means. We don't know who's favourite, who's the underdog, and who's going to come out on top. Those could be all three different things from what we're thinking in this year's Rugby Championship so far. Now, as we go through the next 2 weeks and we start to lead up to these games, I'll put out more and more content talking about it. Once the teams have been announced, of course, I'll do my preview videos. And if you want to join me on the live chat tomorrow from South Africa, I'm going to be on the live stream at 6 p.m. your time, and also in Argentina where it's going to be 1 p.m. in the afternoon if you want to join me for a chat tomorrow and we can talk about this game and all the other things that have happened so far in this year's Rugby Championship. Okay, that's it for this particular video. I'll be back again really soon with some more content. Until then, stay safe, stay well, keep enjoying your rugby across the world, and it's time to say adios from beautiful Cancun in Mexico. Bye for now, everyone.